to be utterly lost beyond hope doesn't require a deviant decision to forge some new path in life. Actually, to be utterly lost beyond hope is simply the consequence of continuing the path that you're already on. We have inborn resistance to God. We have inborn rebellion against God. And if we just continue down that road day after day after day, refusing to submit to God, refusing to admit that we're wrong, refusing to own up, then what's going to happen is one day we're going to cross that invisible line. That's what's going to happen. We're going to move from God's patience into God's wrath. And the scary part about this is that you may not know you're crossing the line. That's what's going on here with Belshazzar. He crosses a line of no return. He crosses the line of God's wrath. Now, I want to be clear in this text. Belshazzar is not simply judged because he was sacrilegious or blasphemous. There are a great many people who have been forgiven of blasphemy and sacrilege. Belshazzar was killed because he went on with his life of disregarding God. And somewhere along the way, he crossed the line. Let me see if I can unfold the story for you this morning. The opening verses describe how some imbibe in sinful living. It's their pattern. It's what they do. They just live in sin. Some imbibe in sinful living. You see that in verses 1 through 3, this grand party. They're swallowing down iniquity like a drunk swallows down a 12-pack. It's as though with each iniquitous move, the following one is just a little bit easier. With each sinful choice, the next one just happens more quickly. Have you ever noticed that in your own life? Have you ever had that experience with sin? You take one, and then you're taking more. You click once, and then you're clicking more. You say this, and soon you're saying that. You give in a little, and soon it's a lot. You listen for a moment, you're listening longer, and it's almost like sin is a snowball. It picks up mass, it picks up speed in our lives, and pretty soon it's gone farther than we ever thought possible. It's gotten bigger than we ever planned. And that's what's going on in Babylon. Belshazzar decides, verses 1 through 3, he decides to have this grand feast. He wants this royal party. He wants to boost morale. He wants to celebrate the new year in Babylon. And so he wants a royal party that's going to outdo all others, a festival of all festivals. And so he has an invitation list that equals somewhere around 1,000. I mean, it's just like all of these lords and ladies fill this grand hall. He has this huge spread of delectable food and wine. Now, if you study history and ancient cultures like Babylon, when kings threw feasts like this, they often devolved into sinful things, orgies of sorts, inebriated engagements of debauchery of all sorts. So it's not a surprise to us that he has all of his wives and concubines near at hand. What you find in this text and what you often find in life is that when people embrace unrighteousness, immorality is close on its heels. What unfolds is probably what we'd expect. Just these variegated expressions of sinful living. Now, what did his sinful living involve? It may not be the exact same as yours or mine, but his sinful living involved sacrilege. Take a look at verse number 2. In Daniel 5, verse 2, Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought. And the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines, so that they might drink from them. So they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. Sinful living involved sacrilege. He grabs these vessels from the temple of the Most High God, these sacred and sanctified vessels for worship in the temple. That's what these were for. And he takes these. It's like he wants to use them for a beer pong at his party. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this. It'd be like, I was trying to think, what are some analogies of this? So you're a teenager, your mom goes out of town, and you go to her china cabinet. And you get all this china out, and you're flopping pizza, and you're having your friends, and you're throwing the plates. I mean, you're like, whoa, those are special. Those have been handed down from generation to generation. Why are you using them that way? Well, here's Belshazzar, and his sinful living is including this sacrilege. He says, go to the storehouse, pull out those vessels from the temple, bring them here, and he begins to use them. You know, even by pagan standards, this would have been something you just don't do. But he didn't care. You can imagine him slurred and slobbering. Bring me those chalices. He doesn't care. And you can imagine how this must have burned in the heart of God. Like, does it bother you when someone takes something that's special to you and misuses it? Can you imagine how this must have bothered God? My own experience, I was reflecting back. I was talking to my older brother when I was in Alaska, and I was reflecting back on a fight we had when we were kids. It was like probably a level 5 conflict. I don't even remember what started it. You know how those are. You're two brothers. They're mad. Level 5 conflict. It went from a level 5 to a level 10. I'm talking throwdown, fisticuffs. I mean, a serious engagement because my brother made a poor decision. He made a big mistake that triggered me. I mean, he set me off. He went over to my bed, grabbed my pillow, stuck it on his bottom, and crop dusted right there in front of me. Now, I don't know how you feel about your pillow, but that's where your head goes. That's where you lay. It's precious and intimate, and it's not supposed to be defiled with the foul odor of someone's rear. But my brother debased my pillow. He irreverently dislodged something that should have been left alone. He polluted something that should have remained clean. I was reflecting again. I can't remember the source of the fight. I just remember I was so mad. I mean, we were at it. I was so mad about a stupid pillow. Can you imagine the heart of God about his sacred vessels? I mean, sometimes we just read through this like, oh, he just grabbed an extra cup. No, he didn't just grab an extra cup. These were the sacred vessels of the temple of the Most High God. He treated them with disregard. Some of you are like, are we talking about temple vessels today? Because the last time I checked, we don't have any temple vessels. Well, do you remember what happened when Jesus died? When Jesus died on a cross, there was something that happened in the temple, something very significant. Anybody remember? Just put your hand in the air if you remember what happened in the temple when Jesus died on the cross. Okay, many of you, what happened is there's this huge veil, and this veil was torn. This place that was called the Holy of Holies, that was separated from that which is common, that veil was torn. Now, some people look at that and they say, well, that means there's nothing that's sacred. See, the veil was torn, the separation of sacred and common, that's removed. There's nothing sacred anymore. But I'd like to suggest to you that it's actually just the opposite. Maybe it's that everything is sacred. Maybe it's that whether therefore you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Maybe it's such that whatever you do in word or in deed, do all in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, maybe he actually wants you to treat all of this as sacred. And yet we treat things with such disregard. We throw out the idea of sacredness and we disregard things that he says are sacred and holy. Can I just give you two? Let me just give you two holy things that are supposed to remain sacred. These are super clear in the New Testament. One is God's church is supposed to be holy and sacred. Do you know that Paul calls the assembly of Christians, he calls it a holy temple? No more are we using bricks and beams and stones and wood to build structures. We have people who are living stones, as Peter calls them, and this is supposed to be a holy temple, a dwelling place for God. It's supposed to be without spot, blemish, or wrinkle. It's supposed to be sacred. Or maybe think about the temple of your own body. This is in 1 Corinthians 6:19. It's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3. This is the will of God, even your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality. Listen to this next phrase. That each one of you know how to control his own vessel. It doesn't use the word body. It's sometimes translated body. The Greek word is vessel. That each one of you understand how to control your own vessel in holiness and honor. I mean, just think about this. Here's Belshazzar, and he is committing sacrilegious acts because he's using these sacred vessels as something that's common. And I just wonder if we're guilty of some of the same things. We're taking sacred assemblies and we're bringing sin into it, or we're taking the sacred temple and we're defiling it in various ways. That's sinful living. And that's not supposed to be. Don't bring sin into the church. Don't engage in sexual sins. And the list could go on and on, but we can't just disregard like there's nothing sacred anymore. No, maybe the death of Christ caused all of this to be sacred, and we should consider that. Well, Belshazzar's sinful living involved sacrilege, but not only that, it also involved blasphemy. Now, sacrilege and blasphemy, they're closely related. Sacrilege is the inappropriate treatment of God's stuff. Blasphemy is the inappropriate treatment of God. And I want to show you this in the text because he does something here that is intentional. It's not just reckless drunkenness, like, oh, the guy was drunk, he did something stupid. No, he's intentionally desecrating things that were of value. He was intentionally stomping on these vessels that were sacred. That's why in verses, I don't know if you caught this, in verses 2 and 3, twice it repeats. It doesn't just say that these were the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar got from Judea or from Jerusalem. No, it says these are the ones that he got out of the temple in Jerusalem. These are the ones, look at verse 3, they were taken out of the temple of the house of God. He wants you to realize these weren't just special. These were sacred. And when he took these, to defile the vessels was to defame God himself. That was his intention in this. He wanted to spurn the true and living God. Many of you know that I'm a reserve chaplain. That's where I was just in Alaska doing some chaplain duty at Eielson Air Force Base. And there, if you walk into the, it's called Amber Hall. It's where the commander of the base is. You walk into Amber Hall right through the front doors. You will notice that there are these like velvet ropes in a circle around a space on the floor. And it's kind of awkward because you walk right in these front doors and you want to go up these stairs that are in front of you, but you can't. You walk in the front doors and you've got to go around, and then you can go up the stairs. You're kind of like, why are these little velvet ropes here? And why? I mean, it'd be a whole lot easier. The straightest way is I don't know what it is, but it's a straight line, That's how you get there. Move with purpose, and I've got to go around. And why do I got to go around? Because if you look on the floor, there's the insignia of the wing right there. The insignia of the 354th Fighter Wing is right there on the floor. And you don't step on it. Don't make a rookie mistake. I've seen some chaplains make some rookie mistake. Don't make a rookie mistake. Don't step on the insignia. Do you know what that would be like? The commander's coming down the stairs, you're just walking straight through, and you step on the insignia. Oh, man, you'd be in trouble. You'd be in trouble. Here's what Belshazzar is doing. Belshazzar is looking up to heaven, and he's saying, watch this. And he steps on it. He's doing it intentionally. He's blaspheming God in what he's doing at this party. This isn't a mistake. The way he's treating these temple vessels was to send a message to the God of Judah to say, oh yeah, what are you going to do about it? Sometimes I think we believe that we can treat God however we want, and we can treat his things however we want. But in this story, you find that that's that just won't slip by. You can't live in this audacity, this calculated and intentional defiance of God. You can't live and say, well, what's God going to do about it? That was the heart of Belshazzar. Belshazzar says in verse number 23, I want you to realize that this is intentional. In verse number 23, it just says this: he lifted himself against the Lord of heaven. Blasphemer. I want to tell you, when you spurn God's guidance, when you tune out his presence, when you decide, I'm going to chart my own course, I'm going to define my own destiny, I'm going to use his name in inappropriate, idle, and frivolous ways, I'll do what I want, that's blasphemy. Some people imbibe in sinful living. But as the text goes on, I want you to see something else. Others laugh with disregard. Some imbibe in sinful living, others laugh with disregard. And what I want to point out here is that there's a distinction in this hall. While this party is taking place, there's a distinction between people. There are court officials who are getting drunk just like everybody else, blaspheming, indulging in sacrilegious acts, just like everybody else. Court officials doing that. But Belshazzar was different. And the reason Belshazzar was different is because he knew better. I want you to go to verse number 22 in the text. Look at verse number 22. And if you underline in your Bible, you should underline this because it's probably the key verse in Daniel chapter 5. The key verse in Daniel chapter 5 is verse 22. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. Look at this next phrase. Though you knew all this. Yeah, some people live sinfully. I mean, we see it all the time. But then there are others who know and still live that way. You know to do right and you don't do it. And that is disregard for God. That's where Belshazzar was at. He purposefully disregarded God with haughty looks, with mocking laughs. He dismissed God and he ignored the truth. He knew better and he didn't care. He understood, but he chose not to submit. He took sin a step further. He made willful, rebellious choices. He spurned God. There's a disregard in this text. And I want to show you his disregard in two ways. There's a disregard for the supremacy of God, and there's a disregard for the work of God. A disregard for the supremacy of God because he chooses idolatry instead of the true and living God. He makes, and listen, friends, I just want to see if I can clarify this. Idolatry is not a whoops. Idolatry is a choice. Idolatry is not a whoops. Idolatry is a choice. It's a choice to exchange something. Romans chapter 1. It's a choice to exchange the truth for a lie. It's a choice to worship the created instead of the creator. It's a choice to worship what's made instead of the maker. It's a choice. Idolatry is a choice. And Belshazzar, in this text, he disregards the supremacy of God and chooses idols instead. Look at verse number 4. Daniel 5, verse 4. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. It's almost as if Belshazzar was saying, I don't care if you claim to be supreme. I don't care if you call yourself the most high. I'm in charge of my life. I want fun and I want pleasure and I want popularity and I want to revel in my wealth and I want to flaunt my power and I don't want you interrupting me. He begins to sing doxologies to non-gods. Praise gold from whom all blessings flow. Praise silver, you creatures here below. He exchanges the truth for a lie and tells God, no thanks. I'd rather have this stuff. And before we look down our noses at Belshazzar, let's just remember the times in our lives where we've done that as well. Where we've just said to God, no thanks. I'd rather have my money. No thanks, I'd rather have my career. No thanks, I'd rather have my porn. No thanks, I'd rather have my pleasure. No thanks, I'd rather have my stuff. No thanks. And when we do that, we're making a choice of idolatry. We're disregarding the supremacy of God. Augustine once defined idolatry. He said this: idolatry is worshiping anything that ought to be used and using anything that ought to be worshiped. Isn't that good? Idolatry, it's worshiping anything that ought to be used or using anything that ought to be worshiped. And so here's the king, and he's paying attention to what's made while disregarding the maker. He's worshiping the created instead of the creator. That's the offensiveness here. Look at verse number 23. Take a look at your text. Let your eyes scan down the page to verse 23. And he says this: you praised, he's indicting Belshazzar. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Look at this: which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. You've paid attention to dead things, to lifeless objects or objectives, and you've disregarded the God who gives life and breath and being. You've paid so much attention this week to work that consumes you, but the Savior is just forgotten Monday through Saturday. Entertainment captivates us, but God can barely get our attention, even though he holds the universe together with the word of his power. Sex in its various forms is our coping mechanism or our comfort or our go-to, and yet God, who offers fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore at his right hand, he's neglected. Do you realize what's going on? We're lifting our glasses to the gods of career, amusement, pleasure, but the God who holds our breath. I just want you to do something. Just take a deep breath. Go ahead. And hold it. The God who holds your breath, you disregard. Go ahead, you can let it out. Thanks. I want you to stay with me. Belshazzar disregarded the supremacy of God and chose idolatry instead. He disregarded the work of God, and he responds with this insolence. I want you to look at verses 18 through 23. Take a look at Daniel 5, verses 18 through 23. As your eyes scan that page, you're going to find that Belshazzar was not ignorant. He was insolent. He was brazen. He was brash. He had knowledgeable disdain for the true and living God. He was aware, I want you to catch this, he was aware of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. We talked about it last week, right? Nebuchadnezzar struck with 7 years because he lifted himself up in pride against the true and living God. He struck to wander around with the dew-filled grass like an ox for 7 years. Belshazzar knew how God treated proud people. Belshazzar knew that story. That's verse 22. You knew all this, and yet you still lifted yourself up against the Lord. He has this insolence. He refused to learn from history. He saw God's judgment, he saw God's discipline, but he would not learn from it. He disregards it. I just was trying to process this text, and I was trying to think what's different between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm going to tell you what's different. Belshazzar knew, and he wouldn't learn. And I just thought to myself, because I grew up in church. My dad was a pastor. I had to sit on the second row. I fell asleep sometimes. It was terrible. Got in trouble for that, I grew up in church. And I learned a lot growing up, but I didn't listen very well. And I wonder how many young people sit in this building week after week. I wonder how many teenagers, how many young adults sit here and you've read your Bible for a long time. Your parents brought you to church all this time. You learned, but you haven't learned. You haven't really learned. You've heard all this stuff. I've heard it all. I've tried all that. You're like Belshazzar. You haven't learned from history. You haven't watched the works of God. Nebuchadnezzar went through the school of hard knocks for 7 years, wandering around like an animal, but Belshazzar wouldn't learn one lesson from it. And I just wonder if there's some young people in this room, and you've watched your parents go through the school of hard knocks. You've watched the discipline of God, and you've watched the judgment of God, and you've watched how they've struggled with sin, and you've watched the forgiveness of God and the grace of God and the mercy of God, but you don't care. And you just keep doing your own thing and you're not learning. Oh, my friend, if that's you, it means you're walking down this path. And remember, there's this invisible line between God's patience and his wrath, and you don't know when you're going to cross it. Belshazzar was insolent, not ignorant. He refused, but it wasn't because he didn't know. I think through the stories of life, maybe you grew up in a home and you knew the destructiveness of substance abuse in someone's life, but you refused to be instructed by that lesson. You've seen the ruin of adultery. You're supposed to be instructed, but you won't listen. You've seen the poverty associated with laziness, the pain associated with gossip, the fall that comes with pride, and yet you close your ears and just do what you want to do. You laugh it off with disregard like Belshazzar. That, my friends, is a disregard for the work of God, and it's insolence. Verse 22 is our clincher verse. Though you knew all this, yet he mocks and he spurns the God of heaven. My friends, know this. It's a serious thing to go on doing what you know is wrong. It's a serious thing to go on doing what you know is wrong. Because just because God hasn't acted doesn't mean he won't. How many years did Belshazzar live this way? Oh, God's not going to do anything. Look, he hasn't done anything. Just because he hasn't acted doesn't mean he won't. Just because he hasn't judged or disciplined you doesn't mean he's overlooked your sin. Don't misunderstand God's patience. He won't be silent forever. Your sin will find you out. When God's judgment comes, it may not be gradual, like cooking a frog in hot water. It may be sudden and without remedy, like being struck by lightning. Some imbibe in sinful living. Others laugh with disregard. But as the story continues, here's the next thing. Up ahead, there's a day of reckoning. Up ahead, there's a day of reckoning. These nobles sloshing around, boozing it up. Nebuchadnezzar spurning the true and living God with brazen disregard, having the party of their life. When all of a sudden in verse 5, it all comes to a halt. I wonder how many people in this room lived a life where you were doing your own thing and God stepped in and brought it to a halt. You got caught. Something happened. You were diagnosed. These things came about. Stuff crashed. The house of cards came down. That's what happens in verse 5. He's going around. He's partying. Life's a big party. And verse 5 happens. Verse number 5, I want you to see the handwriting. We still use this phrase, the handwriting on the wall. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall in the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. This dismembered hand begins to miraculously inscribe words on the plaster. They're giving these toasts to faceless, nameless, artificial, stone-cold idols. But the true and living God, his hand is moving. There's something in this text you're supposed to see. You're supposed to see that the idols, they can't hear, or they can't do anything, they can't move, they can't help you. But the true and living God, his hand moves. His hand is powerful. All this disturbs the king. Verse number 6, look at it. He's no longer red in the face. His color changes. His thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way. I'm going to give you the Hebrew. His limbs gave way. The Hebrew says this: the knots of his loins were loosened. Now you put 2 + 2 together. The dude soiled his diaper. I'm just telling you, that's what it says. He was so afraid he messed his own pants. Right there. Flustered and fearful. He pipes up and he calls for all the astrologers and enchanters and magicians. These wise men were supposed to come with their omen manuals, their willow branches to wave in the air. They were supposed to bring some sheep liver to dissect in front of the king or look up at the constellations of the night sky. But they weren't able to discern or decipher. Isn't this a pattern? Have you caught this? Have you read Daniel? You just read Daniel 1 through 5. You start getting this, you're like, oh, great. Like a pilot who can't fly or a meteorologist who can't tell the weather. These magicians can't interpret anything. And that's what's happening in this text. They can't give the interpretation again. They can't read the writing. So Belshazzar pipes up and he offers status and wealth and position. Verse number 7, whoever reads this and shows me its interpretation is going to be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he's going to be third ruler in the kingdom. But none of Belshazzar's props can help him. When he's really in trouble, his power can't help him, his wealth can't help him, his status can't help him, even his religion can't help him. It's all useless. And I wonder sometimes if God aggravates our helplessness so that he can expose the uselessness of all of our props. He aggravates our helplessness to expose the uselessness of all of our favorite props. Call religion, offer power, bring some money, but none of it will work. Do you know what Belshazzar, listen, when God breaks into your life, do you know what Belshazzar should have done in that moment, what we should do? If God's breaking into your life at that moment, fall down. Fall down. The moment he saw the hand, he should have repented. The moment the inscription begins, he should have just called out for mercy. That's what he should have done. That's what you should do. If God is working, you're seeing him work, you fall down. You plead for his mercy, but he won't do it. There's a day of reckoning coming. And he's walking right towards it, brazen-faced, bold, and proud. What does reckoning mean? Take a look at verse number 26. Remember, these words are inscribed in the plaster. Many, many, tekel, parson. Remember that? Look at verse number 26. Many means your days are numbered. And I don't want you just to read that about Belshazzar. I want you to think that about your own life. Your days are numbered. That means there's going to be a reckoning time. God has this active role in the length of your life. You don't know how many steps you get to take in this journey, but he does. And they're numbered. That's why Moses said, teach us to number our days so that we would have a heart of wisdom. Your days are numbered. Are you ready? Are you ready to settle the accounts? Are you ready to face your Creator? Are you ready to explain yourself to the one who knows everything? I mean, you've been good at excuses. You've blamed a whole lot of people, but are you going to stand before the God who knows all things and explain yourself? There's a day of reckoning. Life's a vapor. Step up to the reality of mortality. You're going to die. You could have an aneurysm. You could get in a car accident on your way home, or a helicopter could drop from the sky, like Kobe's a few weeks ago, right? I mean, nobody planned that. It's not in a schedule, but life's gone. Your days are numbered. We live on a thread. It could be cut by something as simple as a virus. It's fragile. It's fleeting. And reckoning means you're going to face God one day. Your days are numbered. Reckoning means, number 2, you're going to be found lacking. I'm just going to tell you flat out. Verse number 27. Don't read that just at Belshazzar. Yeah, Belshazzar, he was a bad dude. Sure, he's found lacking. But I'll bet if you put my life on the scales of justice, I'd come up okay. No, you won't, my friend. If it's just you and all your works and we put those on the scales of justice, you're not going to come out okay. You're going to be found lacking. In the balance of eternity, all your goodness won't be enough. Can I say that again? The balance of eternity, all your goodness won't be enough. You're going to be found lacking. Tekel. You'll be found wanting. You won't measure up. You won't make the cut. You're going to be deficient. You say, Lukus, how do you know that? Because there's none righteous, no, not one. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Daniel looks at Belshazzar and said, you've been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting. You haven't done enough and you haven't been enough. Here's what reckoning means. Reckoning means your days are numbered. You'll be found lacking. And here's the third thing. Reckoning means all you have is going to be taken away. Verse 28, parson. Daniel says this, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. All you have is taken away. I want you to think about your own life for a minute, my friend. The object of your greatest pride, the product of your greatest work, the fruit of your life's endeavors. I'm going to tell you something. It's all going to be taken away. Do you realize that when you die, you can't take it with you? Never forget this dead guy. I reached into his pocket and just seeing if you're following along. Dead guy reached into his pocket. I did this for real. I was an apprentice funeral director for a while. I was getting this dead guy dressed, put his suit pocket on, and in his pocket was $400 cash. That's enough for lunch and dinner. Now I gave it back to the family, of course. I thought to myself, he's not taking it with him, is he? He's not taking it with him. And neither are you. All your stuff, your education is going to be worthless when you die. Your house is going to be inherited by another when you die. All your cash is going to be divided and given away. And all that you have will be gone. There's a day of reckoning. Some imbibe in sinful living, others laugh with disregard. But up ahead, there's a day of reckoning. So here's the lesson of the story. So do not let your hearts be hard. Do not let your hearts be hard. In verse 29 and 30, the reckoning comes for Belshazzar. He crosses the line from God's patience to his wrath. But there's something we're supposed to learn here. There's an implicit moral to the story. We could read right over it, but we're supposed to be careful readers. We're supposed to catch this subtle lesson. And it's this, that there is a distinction between the way Belshazzar and the way Nebuchadnezzar responded to the revelation of God. We're supposed to catch that when we read this text, because we've been in chapter 2 with Nebuchadnezzar. Remember? Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of this huge statue made of 4 metals. At the end of chapter 2, listen to what happens with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is the God of gods and Lord of kings." Do you remember? That's what Nebuchadnezzar said. Chapter 3, 3 Hebrew men thrown into a fiery furnace. They survive. How does Nebuchadnezzar respond? "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants. There is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Are you catching a pattern? Chapter 4, he finishes grazing like an ox. Nebuchadnezzar's out in the field for 7 years. Finally, he looks up to heaven and says this, "And he blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever." Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. Each time he looks up to God, God reveals himself. He looks up to God. He looks up to God. He looks up to God. God reveals himself in chapter 5 to Belshazzar, and there's this eerie silence. Nothing. Flatline. You come to church week after week after week after week, and you leave here flatline. Nothing. No movement of God, no movement of the Spirit. You don't listen to his revelation of his word. And I'm going to tell you, you are in danger if that's true of you, my friend. It means you're hardening your heart. We're almost expecting, because we've had this pattern of Nebuchadnezzar turning to the true and living God, that Belshazzar will do the same in this moment, but he doesn't. There's nothing. There's this uncomfortable absence of bowing down. Begrudgingly, he gives the gold and he gives the robe and he makes him third in the kingdom, and he just goes on with the evening. His heart is hardened, and the story ends with the Medo-Persian army taking the city of Babylon and killing Belshazzar, verse 30. Judgment of God comes down swiftly and suddenly and surely. I want you to let the words of verse 30 just settle for a second. Just listen to them and let them sit. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. It's almost like you don't know what your day's going to bring. So how are you responding to God's revelation now, right now, in this moment? I want to close. I heard an old man tell a story. I was just flying recently. This old man tells a story about a business trip that he wrapped up. He was heading to the airport to fly back home. He sat in the passenger seat while his driver was taking him to the airport. However, he hit this traffic. I mean, it was like an hour-long gridlock. Have you ever wanted to get to the airport? You know your flight's coming and you're like stuck in traffic. I mean, that's this dude. He's trying to look patient, but you know he's really not. The driver finally gets him to the airport. I mean, time is tight. This old man races through security. He has this like sudden burst of geriatric energy, and he's like going down the terminal. You know, I mean, he's just trying to get there. He gets to the counter, and he's out of breath, and he's red faced, and he looks at the lady, and he says, "Can I get on the plane?" "No," she replies. "The door has been shut." You can almost feel the disappointment of this elderly man. He kind of lets out this, like, I don't know if it was out of pity or just a random act of kindness, but this other airline agent says, well, just a minute, sir, I'll book you on the last flight out. And this man begins to punch in his computer like they do, the clickety-clack of these keys, that it comes to a stop. And the man looks up and he says, unfortunately, sir, that was the last flight out. The door was shut. There were no more flights. And the man was stuck. I think there are people who are racing against the clock of life. They're banking on a last-minute sprint through the terminal. If all else fails, they'll just catch another flight. But my friend, when the day of reckoning comes, when the gavel falls, when the door shuts, it's all done. You're stuck for eternity. Some imbibe in sinful living, others laugh with disregard. But up ahead, there's a day of reckoning. So do not let your hearts be hard. Today, if you hear his voice, harden not your heart. Let's pray. My friends, in the quietness of this moment, I want to urge you to seek the Lord while he may be found, to call upon him while he is near. Oh, if you're one of the wicked, then forsake your ways. If you're unrighteous, then forsake those thoughts and return to the Lord so that he can have compassion on you. Return to our God. He will abundantly pardon you. You may have never thought of yourself as a hard-hearted person. You may have never considered yourself defiant towards God. But if you know to do right and you're not doing it, that's sin. You can't just compartmentalize your transgression. You can't silo your iniquity. Stop ignoring it. Stop swallowing it down. Stop quenching the Spirit. Stop pretending it's not that bad. Today, if you hear God's voice, do not harden